So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Greg Gold. I am the interim dean of the College of Professional Studies, and I'm also the chair of the North Group Sierra Club. And you can be chair too. So we're gathered here tonight in the Native American Forum, located on the traditional lands of the Wiyot tribe. And to honor that connection, I'd like to introduce Cheryl Seidner, former chairwoman of the Wiyot tribe, and she is no stranger to HSU. Worked here for years, so we are honored to have her. Cheryl's going to help us open by offering a prayer.
I was at a loss for words for a moment. Good evening, everyone. How are you doing? Great. You guys behaving yourselves? I hope so. Because you got to remember where you stand is my traditional home. And I born and raised here. When the new president of the university came, I turned around and looked at him and told him not to forget where he was standing. He was standing on sacred ground. And President Roland Richmond never forgot. And it was always good. And I say it in a good way, not in a mean way, and a mean spirit. I know you're here for a really good reason tonight. And I ask that you listen not only with your ears, but listen with your eyes. Listen with your heart. When you talk, speak with kindness. Speak for the generations to come and those who have lost their lives protecting this great country of ours. My uncle died in Korea. He was only 19. I never got to meet him. But he hitchhiked all the way from the Bay Area to come and see his sister, my mom, and to meet his newest niece. That was me. And so everything that we do needs to be done in thought, not in malice. We also have to be bold, stand up, but not be belligerent, because nobody will listen to us if that's the case. They'll just write us off. My friend from Alaska, they lost 3 villages to high water. They had to move the villages back. And that was traditional. That's their traditional land. But I will not continue on. I know you have a lot of business to do. And I thank you for being here, taking your time out to be here and to lend your voice to our congressman, who is here to listen to what you have to say. And I ask him not only to listen with his ears, but with your eyes and with your heart. Because we all listen differently, hear differently. So may I ask you to stand? There's far too many in here to make a circle. And there's far too many in here to ask you to take off your shoes. So I'll be kind. The next time you see me, I might ask you that. Because when you pray, you want to be right down into the earth. You want to be willing to get your hands dirty, your feet dirty, and roll up your sleeves to do the right thing. I know you got a hurt foot. Oh, that hurt to the quick. Gentlemen, if it's not a part of your religious background, I'd ask you to take your hats off. But if it is a part of your religious background, please keep them on. And I am going to pray and ask you to pray with me in the way that you are wanting to do. Donnery Gok with Father God, creator of all things. We ask you, Creator, to be here, to open up our hearts, our minds, and our eyes and our ears to hear what we have to say to one another. We ask you, Donnery Gok with, to breathe new life into what we need to do to go forward. We ask you to bless all those that are here. Ask you to watch over them and keep them safe out of harm's way. We ask you to be with the men and women who are in our armed services, to be with them. We ask you to be with our president and ask you to have him learn to listen with his heart. We ask you to be ready to work on the things that need to be worked on. And may it be an honor to you, Donnery Gok with. We thank you this in your son's name. Oh, thank you, everyone. Oh.
Thank you, Cheryl. We are fortunate tonight to have one of the foremost champions in the environment, a lifetime of service to and advocating for the environment, Congressman Jared Huffman.
Hi folks, let's first see if my microphone is working. Is that doing anything?
No.
I did turn it on. Green light, right? Is there volume control?
It's not close enough.
Are we there? There we go. All right. Well, thanks for that introduction, Cheryl. Thank you for your thoughtful words and for setting a good, reflective, and constructive tone for this conversation. We need more of that in this country, and I sure hope that part of your prayer for our president actually works. Wouldn't it be great if he did a little more thinking with his heart? We'd be in better shape today.
The sound kind of went down.
Uh-oh. Should I just use the microphone? What do you think? Is this... Am I back? A lot of feedback. I'm happy to just get rid of it. This speaker has feedback now. Is this any better if I do it this way? Let's do it this way. All right. So, I am Congressman Jared Huffman. It's great to be with you. I love seeing such a wonderful turnout and a multi-generational turnout from all over this community and all over this campus. We're here to talk about some very important subjects: protecting our environment, trying to preserve a livable planet for future generations, and this political moment that we have to take some pretty bold action that responds to the challenge that scientists all over the world have laid down for us, that we basically have a little over a decade to dramatically transform the global economy in order to hold climate change to 1.5 degrees Celsius or lower from pre-industrial levels. It is a tall order. It is a challenge unlike anything humankind has ever faced, and we are about to find out if all of our talent and ingenuity and vision and problem solving can overcome some of the other qualities of human nature like greed and inertia. So the test is here, and I am very honored, although it's a super difficult time to be in politics. I'm really honored to be there because it's such an important moment, and I feel the weight of that responsibility in a big way. I'm happy to tell you that 3+ months into the new year and the new Congress, you can already see what a change the 2018 midterm election has provided. So, among other things, I am serving in the majority in at least one house of Congress, and that's like a different job, I'll tell you. It's always an honor to serve in Congress, but it's a little bit like if you always wanted to play professional baseball and you finally get called up to the big leagues, but you're playing for like the worst team in the major leagues. It's still really cool to be out there, but pretty soon you kind of want to start winning and playing at a higher level. And I feel like I have an opportunity to do some of that now that we're in the majority. What that means for the issues that I care about is that instead of playing defense and reacting to almost everything all the time, we are holding gavels. I am holding the gavel in a major subcommittee, Water, Oceans, and Wildlife, a subcommittee that has incredibly broad jurisdiction that fits so nicely with this great coastal district that I represent. Also gives me an opportunity to really work hard on a lot of the environmental issues I've spent much of my career working on. But across the House of Representatives, on every committee, you see that gavel in Democratic hands making a huge difference. Yesterday, subpoenas went out to Deutsche Bank for the first time, so we can finally begin to get at some of the truth behind potential corruption and compromising of our administration and our president and his family. These are questions the previous Congress didn't even want to ask, but we're asking those questions, and we're holding the executive branch to account, which is what our government requires to actually function, and it hasn't been functioning so well. So it's a huge difference. The other difference is that Speaker Nancy Pelosi is actually pretty darn green and quite a climate champion. The last time she held the Speaker's gavel, she kind of achieved the high water mark in the history of the United States for addressing climate change. She did create a select committee on climate change. She did that in part because the chair of the powerful Energy and Commerce Committee at the time was a guy named John Dingell from Michigan, who really didn't want to do a lot under the Clean Air Act. He was kind of close to the auto industry. And by creating this select committee and kind of going around that roadblock, Speaker Pelosi was able to support the development of a really comprehensive climate bill that was known as the Waxman-Markey bill that did address a lot of these climate issues that we talk about, proposed carbon pricing in the form of cap and trade, and passed out of the House of Representatives. Didn't go anywhere in the Senate, but think about that. About a decade ago, one House of Congress actually passed carbon pricing and caps on emissions and some really big and bold and visionary things to get ahead of this climate issue. It wasn't quite enough because, again, it didn't pass the Senate. And Speaker Pelosi lost the majority a couple years later, and you know the rest of the story. But we're back now, and one of the first things she wanted to do was recreate a select committee on the climate issue, this time with even higher stakes, and so she's calling it the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. She has appointed me to serve on that committee, and we have begun meeting and holding hearings, and I think we have an opportunity to really make a big difference on this issue. It's not the only thing we're going to do. There'll also be work in all of the committees of jurisdiction. I'm on the Natural Resources and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. There will be, I hope, a big, bold infrastructure package that comes out of this Congress, and we need to make sure that it's very green and very responsive to our climate challenge. And you'll see the Science Committee and other committees, I hope, contributing in a major way to all of that. The other big change is we've got some dynamic new members of Congress, some freshmen even, that come to Congress in a very restless way that I think is great, actually. They're bringing an angst and an energy to the work they do. And one of those folks is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. AOC. I'd rather just say AOC because it's a lot easier. But AOC is part of this mobilization of young people and communities of color that are bringing a new type of urgency to their climate advocacy, and I really welcome it. You know, a lot of folks in Washington didn't quite know what to make of it when AOC arrived, when these Sunrise Movement kids started showing up in offices and demonstrating and things like that. Yeah. Because they do bring an urgency and an audacity, you might say, to their organizing. But you know, the way I view it, I've been trying to make progress on this issue as long as I've been in public service, and challenged in my ability to do that I see suddenly a bunch of young people, a bunch of communities of color, totally passionate, fired up, showing up in big numbers. I want to make them allies, and I want to get us all working together in a multi-generational way, sort of like what I see in this room. I think that's the only way that we're going to get there. There's an old African proverb that if you want to go far, go together. If you want to go fast, go alone. All right, and our problem is we've got to go far fast. So we're going to need something like this. We're going to need to find a way to broaden these alliances and really go to work and get things done. That's why I'm pleased to be a co-sponsor of the Green New Deal. I welcome the vision. It is the first time, to my knowledge, that anyone has attempted to put in form of legislative text something that speaks to this existential climate crisis that the IPCC has laid down for us, something that at least begins to say, here's what we need to do, here's the time frame we need to do it in, and so I welcome it. Now, not everybody does welcome it. It's sort of edgy, and it sounds a little socialist to some people, and frankly, a lot of my Republican colleagues still think the New Deal that got us out of the Great Depression was a bad thing. So, you know, they are totally hyperventilating about the Green New Deal, and they talk about it on Fox News every night. So I think the first thing we've got to do when we talk about this is maybe demystify it a little bit. So let's do a little quiz. How many people have read the Green New Deal resolution? All right, that's pretty good, actually. That's more than Republicans in Congress. All right. So we're going to just do a basic quiz of some things that are either in or not in the Green New Deal. Okay. Achieve net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. In the Green New Deal or not in the Green New Deal? In the Green New Deal, because it has to be, because that's what the IPCC says we have to do. All right, so we've got to get to work on that. And it lays out a few of the ways, again, not in a very specific way, but in a broad policy outline about how we do that by transforming our generation of electricity, by transforming our electrical grid, our transportation systems, and industries, and so on. Okay, banning beef consumption. In the Green New Deal? Not in the Green New Deal. Okay, not in the Green New Deal. There are some references to having a sustainable food system, and I guess there are some folks on Fox News that interpret that to mean we've got to, I don't know, do something about cheeseburgers, but it's not in the Green New Deal. Banning air travel. No, not in the Green New Deal. I was actually in a hearing a few weeks ago where a Republican colleague of mine from Wyoming, Liz Cheney, kind of a well-known last name there, was questioning a witness about the Green New Deal, and in the most over-the-top way, asking the witness if they supported creating commissars to decide when we could go on vacation and when we couldn't, because that's in the Green New Deal. Liz Cheney literally was saying the Green New Deal calls for vacation commissars. So let me just clarify for you, that's not in the Green New Deal. There's nothing even close to vacation commissars in the Green New Deal. Nothing about banning air travel either. All right? There is a reference to supporting multimodal transportation systems, including mass transit, including high-speed rail, but it's a pretty far stretch to say that that means we're trying to ban all air travel and create vacation commissars. So just know when you hear this stuff on right-wing radio and Fox News that there's an awful lot of misinformation about what's actually in this resolution. And I thought about actually spending a few minutes to walk you through what is in it. It's about 13 pages long, and it's double-spaced and narrow margins, so it's not that long. And if I did take that time, I won't do it because I want to dive into a conversation with all of you. But if I did do it, if I walked you through paragraph by paragraph, you're really not going to find much that's radical or extreme or objectionable in this resolution. It acknowledges what the science has already told us. Most of this, pretty much all of this, is beyond serious dispute. And then it talks about the things that everyone knows we've got to do to address this crisis within the time frame we need to act. That's what it is. And the other piece of it is it talks about doing it in a way that actually promotes social justice and equality and solves multiple problems at the same time, especially for frontline and vulnerable communities. That's just a good thing to do, and I don't think it's particularly radical. So take a look at it, read it if you'd like. I'm ready to take your questions. We can talk about any aspect of the Green New Deal, or climate change, or environmental policy. I'm at your service. Who wants to start?
So we've got 2 microphones. Raise your hand, and we will hand you a microphone. You can ask a question, okay? So, start with you, because I saw you.
My name is Michael. I was wondering of the Green New Deal, as well as you're on this new subcommittee that Nancy Pelosi has put you on. What overlap do you see, or how do you see your subcommittee carrying out the portion of goals assigned?
Right, so they're fairly different. The Green New Deal resolution is a non-binding resolution. That's sort of an aspirational statement of goals and policy. Totally consistent, I think, with what I think the Select Committee will produce. Under the rules for this Select Committee, we are not vested with authority to introduce legislation, but we are in fact charged with producing a report to Congress that can look a lot like legislation. Okay, so it may not be a bill per se, but it can absolutely be a policy roadmap. In fact, I want it to be a policy roadmap for what we would need to do legislatively to achieve our climate goals, which are pretty much the goals laid out in the Green New Deal. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah.
Totally behind you on the environment.
Oh, you got it. I'll repeat the question. I think you turned up my room.
But I would like to get things.
Okay.
I would like to not preach to the choir so much.
All right.
We have to, quite honestly, most of the country, as far as I can tell, is center right, Midwest. Green New Deal is a deal breaker for them. They don't like those words. They don't like the connotations, and almost anything the left suggests, they are almost reflexively
Right.
opposed to. So I would like to hear it called jobs and sustainable industries, and move the part about jobs, which is like 3/4 of the way down, to front and center, and then talk about how we can pay for that job retraining, vocational training and coding, with repealing some of the tax breaks that the corporations got. And I think that you will reach many, many, many more people.
Okay, did everybody hear the question? No. So it's essentially that the concern is that with the Green New Deal and the way we're talking about the Green New Deal, we're really struggling with this, huh? That there's a concern that we're simply preaching to the choir. That things like the Green New Deal and the talking points with the Green New Deal really resonate with progressive liberal coastal elites, but they're not going to help us with the Midwest and the South and other places who we need to reach and we need to bring along. I think that's what I heard in the question, and the suggestion was made that instead we should talk about jobs and economic development and things like that. I don't disagree with that. Sustainable, look, there's probably some really smart ways to message it and package it, and I think your point is very well taken. So that is part of our challenge. We've got to meet people where they are and bring them along. It is going to be hard to talk about how big and bold we need to act in places that are fossil fuel dependent. So I will just share with you, on this select committee that I serve on, I have Republican colleagues from Louisiana and West Virginia and other parts of the South who will sort of grudgingly say, okay, we acknowledge climate change is happening and humans probably have a little something to do with it, and we're ready to do that. And they kind of want to get a bunch of pats on the back for coming into that part of the 21st century when it comes to this climate conversation. But the next breath usually has something to do with the wonders of fossil fuel and the wonders of the coal economy in West Virginia and the need to not create economic dislocation, and the need to actually do more offshore drilling in Louisiana, which is what one of my colleagues on the committee wants to do. So that's a hard conversation to have. We can probably get there even with these folks on the issue of adaptation. I think they're ready to have that conversation because a lot of their communities are already getting wrecked by the impacts of climate change. The harder part is they want to continue warming the planet while we restore wetlands and build seawalls and do things to adapt to climate change, and we just can't allow that. We've got to break through that resistance.
Hi, my name's Connor. I was wondering if you could speak about carbon pricing and why it was left out of the Green New Deal, and maybe speak to the idea that a lot of people have, which is that without fixing this issue that basically affects the environment are externalized in the market, that we can never really transition away from fossil fuels. So why do you think that wasn't?
Right. So the Green New Deal did not choose between different carbon pricing models, and there are people who are passionately locked in on cap and trade, or fee and dividend, or a redistributive carbon tax. There's all sorts of different ways to do it. Green New Deal, you're right, was agnostic as to which of those, although it does acknowledge the need to price carbon. And I think that was smart because it's also agnostic on the specific types of carbon-free electricity that we need to transition to. We can have those fights, and if we're fighting kind of between those competing models, that's a good place to be. The other reason I think it's a mistake to get too wrapped up around the specific type of carbon pricing is that we're way too deep in the crisis to rely entirely on carbon pricing, whatever it is. Okay? There's an interesting piece in the New York Times this weekend about that. If you look at the places around the world that have led on climate change, including California, and if you look at the things that have actually driven down greenhouse gas emissions, the things that are working in California and other places are not carbon pricing. The things that are working are performance standards. And you can mix carbon pricing into that. It can be an element of a policy portfolio. But I don't think we have time to rely entirely on that. And that's what some of my colleagues across the aisle want to do. There's actually a bipartisan bill, so it's not just across the aisle. It's a bipartisan bill that is proposing a carbon tax that is a pretty good-looking carbon tax. It would escalate, and it would be adjusted depending on what's happening with emissions. But the quid pro quo for that is we would suspend regulations under the Clean Air Act. So you're basically saying we're going to go only with carbon pricing. And just looking around California and around the rest of the world, that's a losing bet. It takes a long time for these market mechanisms to get fine-tuned and fully take effect. And standing alone without a bunch of these other more prescriptive policy actions, they're just not enough. They don't do it.
We've got it over here.
Giving me a microphone is a little dangerous. So you mentioned that Nancy Pelosi was green, which makes me think that I might not fully comprehend that term.
Yeah.
But if she's green, why does she spend so much time dismissing the Green New Deal? And then how are you what's your strategy for trying to get the Democrats that are beholden to corporate interests on board with some of these ideas?
Yeah. Well, look, I will defend Nancy Pelosi as the greenest speaker in the history of the United States. That may not be green enough for everyone, but I think you'd be pretty hard-pressed to argue that John Boehner or Paul Ryan or Tip O'Neill or anyone else was greener than my neighbor, Nancy Pelosi. You're right, she's not enamored of the Green Deal, and I don't know if that's a generational disconnect or a not invented here thing or what, or the fact that she is a leader that is in command of her part of the institution and she knows where she wants to go. And this thing has kind of, maybe come out of left field and surprised her a little bit. And I think she's very disciplined. She wants to stay on message and on task with the way she knows how to lead. Regardless, I think Nancy Pelosi is totally supportive of everything that's Nancy Pelosi and AOC are actually getting along pretty well. And I think there's a lot of mutual respect there. And I think the idea that there's some sort of civil war or great rift is pretty overstated and maybe a distraction. I think we're all on the same team. You also asked about other members of my caucus who are close to the fossil fuel industry. And it's going to be a challenge. I'll be honest with you. I mentioned that bipartisan bill. That's where they all want to go. They want to go to the easy thing, which is sort of a bipartisan half measure. Even Exxon has priced in a carbon tax to its long-term business plan. That's what they would like to do. Now, the fossil fuel industry would like to say, okay, we will agree to a carbon tax if, and then, it might be something like what this bill proposes. You're going to suspend a whole bunch of other regulations that we don't like. That's a bargain I cannot accept. Or it might be, you're going to grant us congressional immunity from all the litigation that's coming our way from our role in the climate crisis. So there's going to be a bunch of conditions attached to them coming along with carbon pricing. And I do worry that many of my moderate Democratic colleagues are going to want to call that the solution and do it. And our job is to make sure to be vigilant and to look at these things critically and to tell them when something is just not good enough to respond to this crisis. Let's see who's...
Right here. So you mentioned AOC and the Sunrise Movement, and so I want to know if you have personally been in touch with the Sunrise Movement in order to address the youth's priorities?
I sure have. Yeah, I met with their political director in Washington even before the Green New Deal resolution was introduced. One of the first things I did in the new Congress, invited them into my office because I was so impressed. And in fact, this is something I've never done before, but a few weeks ago, did you hear about the Sunrise Movement kind of did the walkouts, the skipping school for the young... I've never joined a bunch of kids who were skipping school and encouraged them to do that, but I did. I did it in Petaluma, and I do think that every once in a great while, something comes along that's important enough that you have to engage in some unconventional advocacy. So I was very proud of them for doing it, and I went and spoke to them on that occasion. And I'd do it again. Are there any Sunrise Movement folks here? Excellent. Good.
Hi, thank you for coming today. I've been wondering, assuming all these climate conscious political roadmaps, as you called it, do pass in the House and we start seeing a lot more legislation coming out, what can the House do to make the Senate bring those bills to the floor and actually make a stand one way or another and vote on them?
Right. So that's a good question, and it's a consideration we have with everything we do. It is not just climate change legislation. It's voting rights. It is civil rights, LGBT rights. It's everything. The Senate is a tough place right now because Mitch McConnell doesn't want to allow a lot of our priorities to even see the light of day. So the answer, I think, on all of these things is we got to put maximum political pressure on the United States Senate. A lot of those folks are up for election in 2020. And if they refuse to take a position and take a vote on issues that a growing number of the American people are with us on, they will face the consequences of that. And I think we apply maximum pressure on the Senate. If that doesn't work, we go out and win some elections.
Hello, so my question is to some of the things that I noticed that are missing from the Green New Deal as I know it. The first Green New Deal that was ever penned out was penned out by Caroline Lucas of the Green Party of the UK. She's their MP, and that was in 2008.
It's been used a lot, that terminology.
Well, as a policy guide, it's only been used by Green Party members until now. This is the first time that Democrats or any party have actually engaged in dealing with the Green New Deal.
Not to disagree too much with you, but I had an opponent running against me in 2012 that used it in his campaign against me. Gotcha. I liked it then. I mean, he was my opponent, but it's been used by a lot of people over time.
It has. 62 Green Party members ran on the Green New Deal in 2010. 2012, Jill Stein, and 2016, Jill Stein, and our current candidate, who's going to be running in our primary, Howie Hawkins, was one of the original Green New Deal candidates. So some of the things that I noticed missing out of there are our socialist policies, our anti-capitalist policies, our anti-imperialist policies about cutting the military by 50%, as well as dealing with the prison industrial complex, and with democracy legislation as far as ranked choice voting, proportional representation. The statistics show that we actually do not have good representation in this country. Everybody's got about a 90% re-election rate, but about 10% in actually following through with what society wants to see proposed. So seeing as it's a non-binding resolution, which means that nothing really can come from that besides the statement, do you look to see those policies that were cut out of the Green Party's Green New Deal reinserted, such as cutting this extremely bloated military spending?
Okay, so first of all, I can't speak to anything being cut out or anything like that. My understanding is that the Sunrise Movement and AOC and Senator Markey, the folks who put this together, were not cutting stuff out from the Green Party. That's just not how they built this thing. They endeavored to put together a roadmap to address our climate crisis and to do it in a way that broadly addressed social and economic justice and created jobs. So it's as simple as that. They're not cutting and pasting from other efforts that have used similar terminology. I'm sure there's a lot of great stuff in the Green Party platform and in other usages of the Green New Deal, but that's just not what this was about. Do I support some of the things that you just mentioned? Sure. I have yet to vote for a defense budget in my 7 years in Congress. I vote against it every time, because it is bloated, and it's getting more bloated. I think we've got more work to do on criminal justice reform, but I did support the criminal justice reform incremental progress in the last Congress, and I will support even more. So I suspect we'll have pretty broad agreement on many of the things you mentioned, but that's just not kind of what this package was put together to do.
Military spending.
Yeah, defense budget, that's what I mentioned, yeah. Where am I?
Over here. Hi. To your right.
There you are. My friend from CC.
Yes. CCAT.
CCAT. Okay.
He toured CCAT earlier today. The Campus Center for Appropriate Technology, y'all. Okay. I've never had the opportunity. Oh. What?
We need some appropriate technology in this sense.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to ask you what you would suggest as a congressman to citizens that we do to help implement all of these things that we're mostly on the same page about environmentally here. Yeah, just what would you ask us to do?
Great question. First of all, I think I'm going to start by thanking you for what you are already doing, because I see a lot of engagement here. I enjoyed our tour of CCAT, and a great chance to appreciate the energy and the vision that is part of that place, and think about how all of you are going to go forward in your lives and be inspired and changed by that experience here at Humboldt State. So look, I think all of us in every way we can, including at the personal level, including in our own just day-to-day lives with our friends and families, need to try to make a difference. And I think it's as simple as that. Some of us will be able to do that in different ways. Some people will become scientists and lawyers and invent breakthrough technologies, or have a chance to fight for public policies that can be really transformative. Others will go on to teach children in ways that instill the right values and help drive change in that way. Others will just influence their own children and their own family and the people in their lives. All of it matters. And so I'm not going to say there's one thing I want all of you to do, but I do hope everyone in this room at least resolves to do everything we possibly can to make a difference.
Hello. Thank you for being here again. And for all of you being here as well. It is so exciting to see this start having steps being taken. The Green New Deal is so massively exciting, but something that I feel is missing is something so essential to the climate crisis, which is the international aspect. We pulled out of the Paris Agreement, as well as the Kyoto. And in the international stage, we are not doing so great in terms of climate reputation. So the Green New Deal deals with domestic, like what the US is doing, but how do you see our international climate relations going forward, and does the Green New Deal drive any of those in any way?
So I just want to point out that the Green New Deal does actually speak to that. It points out that the US has, first of all, a responsibility to the rest of the world because we have historically produced more of the greenhouse gas emissions than anyone else. So we are, in some ways, the source of the problem. But we also have the unique capacity to lead, and the technology, and the capital, and the credibility, and the stature. So the Green New Deal actually does talk quite specifically. I'm just looking at page 10, and there's several references toward the end of the resolution that speak to that. It talks about making international agreements, trade agreements, and other things comport with these goals and values. So I think it's there. I think it's there. It's not very specific, but it's not specific on any of the other things too. It's a very broad level framework, and the specifics need to be fleshed out by me and my colleagues and others that try to put this into action.
One of the specifics that I'm hearing more about, even from environmental groups, is nuclear energy. So Union of Concerned Scientists recently said there's probably going to be a need for a limited use of maybe existing plants, but I'm also hearing rumblings from Republican Congress people about building probably, or looking at nuclear in a bigger way, which would be pretty frightening. And I'm wondering if that is something that is being considered and discussed by Democratic Congress.
Yeah, the short answer is not specifically. The Green New Deal itself is technology neutral, right? It simply says we've got to get to net zero by 2050. Even before 2050, we've got to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions from energy generation. But it doesn't, and it does talk about prioritizing clean renewables, but it doesn't take nuclear off the table. I think that's probably the right starting point, and I say that as someone that doesn't like nuclear at all. So I'm anti-nuclear. I certainly know that we're not going to see any nuclear here in California. We've got a moratorium that the voters, I think, have wisely put in place. And I think many other parts of the country are not going to go anywhere near nuclear. They're just not going to want it in their state or in their community because it's not safe, or at least I feel, and many people feel, it's not safe. There's also the waste problem and the proliferation problem. So all of that, I think, is reason why you don't want to rely on nuclear. I have folks who, with perfectly good intentions, that care about this climate problem, and they are totally dismissive of anything except nuclear. They think it's the only way to solve this problem. And if that's the only way to solve this problem, we're in real trouble, because I think most places are not going to want nuclear. But if there's some place out there that really, really wants nuclear, and they can assure that it's not going to compromise the safety of their neighbors, and that they will safely retain and dispose of all of the waste and do it in a way that doesn't raise a proliferation risk, I guess I'm not ready to say categorically they can't do that. I just know it's not coming anywhere near California. And they shouldn't assume they can put it on our roads and trains and take the waste to Yucca Mountain either, because that doesn't work.
I'm worried about this thing here. I want to apologize. I haven't gotten a chance to read this yet. I'm stuck in the office grading papers, stacks of papers. Some of you may feel that pain. But my question has to deal with the issue of labor and how that comes into play with the Green New Deal. As I said, I haven't read it. Here locally, we have a number of projects, offshore wind projects and a wind project onshore. And one of the companies, Terrigen, we've asked if they were going to support unionized labor, and hire unionized labor that's living wage jobs for our community and enter into things like community benefits agreements, which are really important for us. So environment and labor connections here, but they refuse to. So we're gonna have a wonderful green project, but it's not gonna be blue. So what I'm wondering is, are you an advocate of these community benefits agreements, project labor agreements? Is it in the Green New Deal? And can we get these in the Green New Deal so that we can guarantee?
It is. I don't know how quickly I can actually point you to the exact language, but it is replete with commitments to good paying jobs, to union jobs, to protecting the right to organize and collectively bargain for better wages and benefits and community benefits. All of that is, I think, very well reflected in this resolution. And I support, it references prevailing wage as well, and these are things, project labor agreement you mentioned, that I certainly support. I want to make sure that as we do infrastructure, including clean energy infrastructure, we're doing it the right way for communities and for workers.
Wow, I'm loud. Would you give us a timeline on where it is right now? Are we thinking 1 year, 2 years, or in my lifetime that it's going to get to the Senate?
You talking about the Green New Deal resolution, or
no, not the resolution,
just
the actually getting
action
to the action.
Yeah.
Other than just talking and being in committees.
Yeah, I think not only this year, but perhaps in just a matter of weeks, we will pass some important legislation over to the Senate. That legislation will probably be a bill that requires us to stay in the Paris COP21 climate agreement. That's a starting point. That's not the only thing we need to do, but it's a really important starting point. And I think that's going to be a great pressure point for us to put on Mitch McConnell in the Senate. Why will they not? Most of the people in America want us to stay in the Paris Agreement. Most of the senators, even Republicans, were critical of President Trump when he arbitrarily and unilaterally attempted to pull us out of that agreement. So we've got some material to work with while that sits in the Senate, and we'll put pressure on them. Maybe we can get a vote. Obviously, Trump would veto it if we were able to pass it. But all of this, really helps drive public opinion and can help drive change. So I think it's important. It's going to take a little while longer to do bigger and bolder bills that can make it to the Senate. We're going to need a new president, obviously, to actually get these things signed into law. So, but I guess I'm seeing reason for hope on that front as well. It's already a really huge field of candidates, really talented folks, and gosh, almost all of them are talking about climate change, not just as part of their campaign, but as a pillar of their campaign. In some places, you've got people like Jay Inslee running around saying it's the main thing why he's running for president. That's a good sign that we've got serious presidential candidates elevating the issue to that kind of priority.
Hi, what do you think about possibly introducing a tax on meat products, or at the very least removing some subsidies from animal agriculture, as it is a major contributor to climate change?
That's not something I'm really working on right now, or that I think is probably politically viable in this moment. But if you were going to do a carbon tax and do it right, you would look at the carbon footprint of all these different things, and there would be at least some indirect carbon pricing that went into sectors that produce greenhouse gases. So probably not quite what you were looking for, but...
Hi. My name's Avery. I'm a sophomore at Arcata High School. I just want to get your opinion on which aspects of the Green New Deal should be voluntary and which should be stuff that the Congress will enforce. Because we've seen a lot of legislation like the Paris Agreement that is voluntary, and I want to make sure that these things do happen.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. First of all, the Green New Deal resolution itself is totally non-binding. It is a resolution, which means it's basically just a statement of policy. It's a vision statement. There would need to be a whole bunch of very specific legislation to put this stuff into action. And some of that would have to be prescriptive. I talked about performance measures. That's one of the obvious ways in which we've got to just set caps on certain things. We've got to say that each state must achieve 100% fossil-free energy by a certain date, and we can give them flexibility on how they get there. They can develop their own plans to get there. This is kind of how the Clean Power Plan worked that President Obama was relying on when he made his commitments in the Paris Agreement. The Clean Power Plan did provide a lot of flexibility for states to do it in different ways, but everybody had to get there. And I think we're going to have to do something like that across the board on energy generation. We're going to have national standards that are prescriptive with teeth in them for transportation. And we're going to have to look at other sectors. We're going to have to look at agriculture, and we're going to have to look at how we manage our public lands. Obviously, you can't have, voluntary methane rules for fracking and things like that. You're just going to have to put some bans and some rules and prescriptions in place. So a lot of it will have to be prescriptive. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi. First of all, one tiny point, and that is I would like to hear alternate models of the economic universe described not as left, but as centrist. We need to return to a radical centrism, which is the essence of America. And all the dividing us into left and right doesn't, it doesn't dance well, The thing here at Humboldt State University, we are facing budget cuts. And I'm thinking of after World War II, Japan was decimated. And what saved Japan, there's a French writer named Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber who wrote a book called World Challenge. And in it he said, yes, Japan had no natural resources, but they discovered their most important natural resource, which was their intelligence. And this is what's being developed here at HSU, or it could be, if we get the funding, so that departments don't get cut. Like they cut the Arab studies, they cut German studies down to practically nothing. Now we've got French, Spanish, and Chinese, and Spanish and Chinese are fine, and French is good because that's the major language in Africa these days. But how do we develop our most important natural resources, our intelligence, not just our intelligence, but our thirst for learning?
That's a big and heavy question. I'm not sure I'm able to fully answer that question, but I don't disagree with your observation that our human intelligence is a critical part of how we're going to get through this, and we need to invest more in developing it. So let's agree on that. In terms of the labels, left, right, center, I try not to use a lot of those. I hope I'm not using a lot of those. I don't feel like it's particularly productive to get stuck with any of those labels. I think we need to just look at things that make sense. And so that's why you'll hear me very open to market mechanisms, as long as that's not the only thing we're relying on, because I think they're slow, and I think they take time to be fine-tuned, and there's trial and error in developing market signals, and we don't have time to rely entirely on that. So I'm also going to talk about things that are a little more prescriptive that some might try to put in the box of left. But we've got to look at every tool in the toolbox, do the things that make sense, do the things that solve this problem in the limited time we have to solve it, in my opinion, and invest more in education so that you all can invent new ideas and solutions that we can't even think of right now. Yeah.
Hello, and thank you for coming this evening. My name's Keenan, and I'm with a local group called the Coalition for Responsible Transportation Priorities, and we advocate both infrastructure and policies that are promoting mode shift and making it safer for pedestrians, cyclists, users of mass transit to get around. And so something that's been on my mind is the interface between the Green New Deal and basically, you know, down in the trenches, the nitty-gritty of local policy of transportation. And the fact that, you know, you still have thousands of cities with, you know, their parking minimums and publicly subsidized infrastructure for fossil fuel burning cars. So I guess my question for you is, and I know that this is going to be fleshed out later, but if you have a concept now of how the Green New Deal as a national policy interfaces with, you know, basically, you know, local politics and the realities of the design of, say, a small rural town like Arcata or like Eureka, what does that look like?
I think it's going to look different in each community, and I think what we need to do at my level, at the federal level, as we pass transportation infrastructure legislation, for example, is to provide incentives and funding for communities that do smart and innovative things, that reduce greenhouse gases and build more livable communities and support multimodal transportation. I don't think we can really dictate exactly what that needs to look like in every community. I doubt that you're going to build a lot of subways here in Humboldt County, but you can certainly build a lot of pathways, and you can do creative things to address this issue, and I can try to find federal funding to support that planning and implementation. So it's not just transportation, I guess I would say. My staff always puts a really full agenda for me whenever I'm up here, and I was meeting with some real visionary community leaders in agriculture and food systems earlier today. And they were talking about I see Ann and others here in this room. Ann? They were talking about their vision of bringing together organic family farmers in this area, the folks at food banks that have gotten really good at the logistics of handling and storing and distributing food, folks who want to build a full-time farmers market, others in this partnership of a sustainable and healthy local food system. And there's some pretty exciting things that could happen, that are happening really in this community. I want to find ways to support that too. I will not, as your congressman, you know, try to dictate every solution at the community level to these things, but I will look to, you know, really innovative, visionary action that's going on in these places and try to just send help. That's how I view it.
So speaking on the Green New Deal, one of the first paragraphs states that we seek to become a carbon neutral country, and that kind of speaks on our international carbon footprint. And how will our exports and imports be included in this idea? Because if we're supporting exports or imports that are carbon heavy, Malaysia and Indonesia are burning their forests for palm oil. Indonesia in 2010 was responsible for 20% of the human-caused greenhouse gases. And if we're importing products that contain that, we're supporting international carbon. How is that included, and how will that be taken care of?
Great question. Great question. The resolution does speak to the need to address that. It doesn't go into that next level of detail and spell out exactly how you do it, although it does reference trade agreements and other international agreements as essential parts of that. And I agree with that. So one of the reasons I was opposed to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was something that President Barack Obama was really pushing in his final couple of years in office, is because it squandered a huge opportunity to do some of this. It started out, the early versions of the TPP undertook to include climate policy in our international trade agreements, as we should, right? If we're serious about this issue and we have folks that want to gain access to our markets, we should leverage that power to get them to do good things on climate policy and level the playing field for our businesses that we hold to very high clean energy and climate standards. So it's just kind of obvious that trade agreements from this country should reflect these issues. The TPP was totally silent on climate change. The Republicans went through and literally purged every reference to climate change, and it was just a huge squandered opportunity. So it was one of several reasons why I couldn't support it and refused to vote for Trade Promotion Authority to let it go forward. Another piece of this is corporate social responsibility, because we do have such a globalized economy, and many of our big companies, I mean, you can think of sort of Apple as a great example, or any number of tech companies, they make a lot of their stuff, and they have supply chains that are all over the world. We need to find ways to create incentives for them to leverage those supply chains and that global footprint to drive change in other countries. And they can do it. In fact, Apple talks about actually doing it. They talk about the fact that some of the new renewables in China are being used to make their products, and it's because they've insisted on that. That's a good thing. I think we'd like to see more of that. And I'd like to explore how we can maybe even here in the United States create stronger incentives for that kind of corporate social responsibility, maybe through the tax code. So companies that actually look at their entire carbon footprint and use their supply chain and their vendors and, you know, really try to be socially responsible across the board and drive down their climate footprint, maybe they qualify for a slightly lower tax rate. We should look at that, and we should try to get business and corporate citizens in on this transformation, because they can make a difference. Mm-hmm.
Hi. My name is Sina, and I live in Humboldt County, and I want to speak to the urgency of this. We have many, many plans and great ideas, but we don't have 10 years. We don't have 12 years. We have to do things now. How do we get the people that are not owning up to the facts of climate change, and they're saying, well, it's not a real thing, or, gee, I have to be thinking of my constituents. How do we get them to act? What pressure can we put on them?
You know, there's no single answer to that. Each of them is a different individual in a different district, but we should just keep trying and keep pushing. And remember that despair is not a very productive mindset. So I wish I didn't have colleagues that were still denying climate science. I wish I didn't have colleagues that were still totally in the grip of the fossil fuel industry. And I probably will continue to be frustrated by them for years to come, but I can't let that hold me back from doing as much as I possibly can, from reaching those colleagues and others who can be persuaded and can be brought along. So I don't know if that's a very good answer to your question, but I guess I'm just not a big believer in throwing up our hands in despair and saying, you know, these people are hopeless. I think we've got to keep trying, and really, we can never stop trying on this issue. The best time to plant a tree, everyone knows, is 10 years ago, right? Okay? Next best time is right now.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Congressman. If you're a Kevin Murray student, make sure you sign in. I want to thank you all. This is how change happens. You're making the change. Thank you for being here.